$14 billion. That number does not appear on any billboard in Ouagadougou. It is not announced at a press conference. It does not interrupt the evening broadcast. It simply sits, quietly, inside the structure of a country that most of the world has already decided is too small, too poor, and too unstable to deserve a serious conversation. But here is the thing about silence. Silence is not the absence of information. Silence is often the most expensive thing a government can offer its creditors. And for Burkina Faso, the silence around its debt architecture has cost more than most people realize, not just in money, but in sovereignty, in options, in the very ability to decide what happens next. Let us slow down. Let us actually read the ledger. Because when you look at the full picture of what Burkina Faso owes, who it owes it to, how those loans were structured, what conditions were attached, and what got traded away in the process, you stop seeing a poor country making bad decisions. You start seeing a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Quietly, methodically, and with the full cooperation of institutions that present themselves as partners in development. That reframe matters, and it is where this story begins. Burkina Faso is a landlocked nation in West Africa, one of the least publicized countries on the continent when things are going well, and one of the most discussed when things fall apart. It has gold, significant amounts of it. It has manganese, cotton, zinc, agricultural capacity, a young, growing population with real economic potential. On paper, this is a country that should have room to breathe. And yet, the debt. The country's total public debt, when you include external obligations across multilateral lenders, bilateral creditors, regional development banks, and commercial borrowings, runs into figures that dwarf what the average citizen would ever connect to their daily reality. Economists and analysts who track sub-Saharan fiscal policy have placed Burkina Faso's external debt burden at levels that consume a disproportionate share of the country's export earnings and government revenue year after year. The ratio of debt service to government income, meaning the percentage of what the state collects that immediately goes back out the door to pay obligations, has at various points climbed toward levels that leave almost no room for the country to invest in itself. To understand why, you have to understand how these loans were built. The architecture of multilateral debt in lower-income nations is rarely designed around what the borrowing country needs. It is designed around what the lending institution can offer, what conditions make the deal viable for the lender's broader mandate, and what reforms the borrower must agree to in exchange for access to capital. This is not conspiracy. This is documented policy. The IMF calls them structural adjustment conditions. The World Bank calls them development benchmarks. The African Development Bank has its own framework, but across all of them, the underlying logic is similar. If you want the money, you agree to shape your economic governance in ways that are compatible with the lender's model. What does that mean in practice? It means liberalizing your financial sector before your local institutions are strong enough to compete. It means reducing state subsidies, including fuel and food subsidies that millions of poor households depend on. It means privatizing public enterprises, often before any domestic investor has the capital or the technical infrastructure to purchase them. It means committing to debt repayment schedules that are fixed and non-negotiable, even in years when commodity prices crash, when drought cuts agricultural output, when security crises drain the national budget. Burkina Faso has lived all of these at once. The gold sector, which should be the crown asset of economic sovereignty in this country, is largely in the hands of foreign mining companies operating under contracts and fiscal arrangements that were negotiated during an earlier era. The royalty rates, the tax holidays, the repatriation rules, the local content requirements or lack thereof, all of this was set during a period when the country's bargaining power was limited by the very debt it was already carrying. That circularity is the trap, and it deserves to be said clearly. A country borrows under conditions. Those conditions weaken its ability to generate independent revenue. That weakened revenue base makes it harder to service the debt. That difficulty puts it back at the negotiating table. At that table, new loans are offered, but again with conditions. The new loans often include requirements to open more sectors to foreign capital, to maintain a stable exchange rate at the cost of domestic monetary flexibility, to keep public wages low, to cut education and health budgets in percentage terms relative to GDP. The country agrees, because the alternative is default, and default brings its own catastrophic consequences. Around and around. Now this is where the conversation around Ibrahim Traoré becomes economically significant. Not as a personality story, not as a question of military governance, but as a question of what it looks like when a leader inside this trap refuses to keep running the same circle. Traoré came to power in a country already strained by security spending, already committed to a debt structure it did not design, already watching its gold revenues flow outward while its citizens lived on the edge of food insecurity. His public statements about the relationship between African nations and their creditors, his framing of foreign military presence as connected to economic extraction, his rhetorical insistence on sovereignty as a precondition for development. These positions did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a reading of the ledger that most Western-aligned economic commentary refuses to make with the same directness. Whether or not one agrees with the political decisions made in Ouagadougou, the underlying economic analysis that drives that government's rhetoric is not fringe. It is, in fact, consistent with decades of serious academic work on post-colonial debt dependency in sub-Saharan Africa. The names who have documented this most rigorously, from economists at African universities to scholars in Paris and Washington, who have spent careers reading IMF program records, all arrive at a similar conclusion. The debt system, as currently structured, does not primarily serve the development of borrowing nations. It primarily serves the stability and return expectations of creditors. That is not a radical statement. That is a ledger observation. And the ledger for Burkina Faso right now is worth reading carefully. The external debt stock has grown across multiple administrations, each of which faced the same structural pressures and arrived at the same conclusion. Borrow more to stabilize today and manage the consequence later. Later arrived. It arrived in the form of a security crisis that required enormous government expenditure. It arrived in the form of gold price volatility that exposed how dependent fiscal stability had become on a commodity the country did not fully control. It arrived in the form of a population that had been told, generation after generation, that the sacrifices were temporary, that the conditionalities were reasonable, that the partnership was genuine. The partnership produced debts the people will be paying for decades. Here is something specific worth sitting with. The way multilateral debt for nations like Burkina Faso is actually structured often involves what analysts call grace periods, meaning years during which only interest is paid and principal repayment is deferred. This sounds generous, but what it actually does is extend the timeline over which the creditor extracts return, while giving the borrowing country a false sense of breathing room in the early years of a loan. By the time principal payments begin, the country's fiscal capacity has often been reshaped by the very conditionalities attached to that same loan. The repayment schedule hits at exactly the moment when internal reform has cut the revenue streams the country might have used to repay. The World Bank and IMF would dispute that framing. Their economists would point to poverty reduction data, to infrastructure built, to school enrollment rates that improved in certain periods. And some of that data is real. Development finance does produce real outcomes in targeted areas. But the question of economic sovereignty asks something different. It does not ask whether some goods were delivered. It asks who controlled the delivery. It asks who set the terms. It asks what the country gave up in order to receive what it received. And when you ask those questions about Burkina Faso's debt history, you find that control has rarely sat with Ouagadougou. The gold story is the clearest window into this. Burkina Faso became a significant gold producer in the 2000s. At various points in recent years, gold has accounted for the large majority of the country's export earnings. This should be transformative wealth. In an economy with a GDP measured in the range of around $17 to $19 billion, having gold exports running into multiple billions annually is not a small thing. That is the kind of resource base that, under a different structure, could fund education, fund energy infrastructure, fund a domestic industrial base, and reduce the country's dependence on external borrowing. But the operational model of the gold sector was designed before that potential was fully understood, and it was designed by people who were not primarily interested in maximizing Burkina Faso's share of the return. The contracts that govern large-scale gold mining in the country include stability clauses, meaning the state agreed not to change the fiscal terms of the arrangement for a defined number of years. It includes repatriation rights, meaning the foreign company can take its profits home rather than reinvest them domestically. It includes transfer pricing structures that legal scholars who study tax avoidance in extractive industries have written extensively about. The result is that the country sits on enormous gold wealth and captures a fraction of what that wealth could reasonably be redirected toward public investment. Now measure that against the debt picture. The country is borrowing, partly to fund public expenditure that domestic revenue from gold should theoretically be able to support. But domestic revenue from gold is limited by contracts the country signed under fiscal pressure in an earlier decade, so it borrows. And the borrowing comes with conditions, and the conditions limit the country's ability to renegotiate the gold contracts, and the gold contracts limit domestic revenue, and limited domestic revenue means more borrowing. This is not a coincidence of unfortunate events. This is a system. And this is precisely the context in which Ibrahim Traoré's public position on economic sovereignty becomes more legible. The question is not whether Burkina Faso can simply declare itself free of its debt obligations tomorrow. The question is whether the debt structure, as it currently exists, is compatible with the idea that this country is actually sovereign in any meaningful economic sense. The answer, when you read the ledger carefully, is troubling. Consider what happens when a country of Burkina Faso's debt profile enters a crisis. It cannot devalue its currency independently because it is part of the CFA franc zone, a monetary arrangement in which the currency is pegged to the euro, managed in relation to the French treasury, and governed by a framework that prioritizes monetary stability over developmental flexibility. This means that one of the classic tools a country uses to manage a debt burden, currency adjustment, is simply not available. The country is doubly constrained, externally by its loan obligations, internally by its monetary architecture, and both of those systems were designed with priorities other than Burkinabe economic autonomy at their center. The CFA franc debate is its own long conversation. But it cannot be separated from the debt discussion, because the monetary constraint and the debt constraint interact in ways that continuously reduce the government's room to maneuver. A country that cannot adjust its exchange rate, cannot default without catastrophic isolation, cannot renegotiate contracts mid-term because of stability clauses, and cannot significantly raise revenue from its primary export sector because of pre-existing mining agreements, is a country operating inside a box that its creditors and monetary partners built. And the $14 billion figure, which represents an estimate of the cumulative external obligations that analysts tracking West African debt have associated with Burkina Faso's debt stock and commitments in recent years, is the price of living inside that box. What would it look like to begin building a way out? This is the question that policy-minded observers have started to ask more seriously, not just in Ouagadougou, but across the continent. And the answers, while complicated, are not mysterious. Contract renegotiation, done strategically and legally, with a focus on increasing royalty rates and reducing tax holidays for extractive industries, can change the revenue picture without triggering international isolation. Comprehensive debt audits, not accusations but actual forensic reviews of loan terms, who received commissions, what conditions were attached, whether the projects funded actually delivered the value promised. These audits have been conducted in other countries and have produced real renegotiation leverage. The concept of economic sovereignty that figures like Ibrahim Traoré invoke publicly, whatever one thinks of the political context, is not exotic economics. It is what countries like Norway did with their oil. It is what Botswana partially did with its diamonds. It is what Malaysia did with its palm oil sector. It is what the entire modern development literature, at its most honest, acknowledges that resource-rich nations should do but are often prevented from doing by the very frameworks attached to the capital they borrowed to survive. The difference is that Norway had political independence, monetary independence, and institutional capacity that Burkina Faso was never given the conditions to develop. And the debt is part of why those conditions never arrived. There is a sentence that people who study this system eventually arrive at. It is not a comfortable sentence. It is this: the poverty of resource-rich African nations is not an accident of geography or culture or capacity. It is a product of a financial architecture that was built to produce exactly this outcome. Not because every individual within these institutions is malicious, but because the incentive structure of the system rewards extraction over development, rewards creditor stability over borrower growth, and rewards compliance over sovereignty. Burkina Faso is not an outlier in this story. It is a case study. And the fact that most mainstream coverage of Burkina Faso focuses on security incidents, on governance questions, on whether this leader or that leader is legitimate, is itself a feature of how the system protects itself from scrutiny. If the conversation is always about instability, it never has to be about the structural conditions that produce instability. If the story is always about the general, it never has to be about the contracts the general inherited. But the contracts are there. The debt figures are real. The royalty arrangements exist in documents that can be reviewed. The IMF program conditions are published. The CFA monetary framework is a matter of public policy record. None of this is secret. It is simply explained with sufficient complexity that most people change the channel before it becomes clear. This is what the ledger looks like when you actually read it. Burkina Faso is not a failed state that borrowed recklessly. It is a nation that entered a debt architecture under conditions of extreme vulnerability, signed contracts during periods when its negotiating position was weakest, and has been locked into repayment obligations and sectoral arrangements that continuously limit its ability to grow out of the problem. The $14 billion figure is not the cause of the crisis. It is the crystallized evidence of a relationship that was never designed to end in Burkina Faso's favor. And the real question, the one that economic sovereignty as a concept forces us to ask, is not whether we feel sorry for a landlocked country in West Africa. The question is whether we are honest enough to look at the architecture clearly and ask who built it, who it serves, and what would actually have to change for the ledger to one day read differently. That question is not going to be answered by any single government or any single leader. It is going to be answered, if it is answered at all, by the accumulation of enough pressure, enough clarity, enough public understanding of how these systems work, that the systems themselves can no longer hide behind the language of development and partnership. The wealth of Burkina Faso is real. The gold in the ground is real. The young population is real. The agricultural capacity is real. What is not real is the fiction that the current financial architecture is the only possible architecture, or that the conditions attached to its debt were ever primarily designed with the Burkinabe people in mind. A country does not have to be at war with the world to ask for a different deal. But it does have to understand, clearly and without illusion, exactly what deal it is currently in. That is what reading the ledger means. That is what economic sovereignty demands. And that is the conversation that $14 billion of silence can no longer afford to postpone.